Vanessa, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. It's fantastic to be here, Michael. Really looking forward to our conversation today.
No worries. Merry Christmas as well.
Yeah, Merry Christmas. It's great to be here. Happy holidays wherever you are and however you celebrate it.
That's right. It's nice and sunny in San Salvador, unlike a lot of places in America. But the first thing I want to dig into is I'm not too familiar with your story. So if you just want to share, I suppose, like a brief of your story, how you got into crypto, how you found Monero, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, so my crypto journey goes back a long time, back to the early 2000s, actually, when I was working finishing up my college degree, and I was doing a project related to anonymous digital cash. So back in the day, of course, this was before blockchain, before Satoshi. You might be familiar with folks like David Chaum, who were running systems called eCash and DigiCash, and really like diving into like, what does it mean to have cash, to be transferable, to allow the transfer to happen, whether you're offline or online. And one of the big challenges at the time was cash required an intermediary. You had to trust someone in order to do it. So you couldn't get to the full expression of anonymous digital cash back then. And so that's what piqued my interest in this whole idea of anonymous cash. And it was around 2013, 2014 when I first became aware of Bitcoin, and started to dabble just a little bit, learning a bit more about it. And I was at the precipice of really jumping in big. And opened my Mt. Gox account. I was ready to go, and it just felt so shady. It felt like really there was something in my gut that said, "No, this is wrong." And it turned out it was wrong. But unfortunately for me, it scared me away from the crypto ecosystem for a couple of years because I do feel like it's I'm not a lawbreaker necessarily. I like to be at least somewhat upfront with my actions. And it seemed like the ecosystem at the time, there was very much the sense of like there's a dark underbelly to it. And so I came back in about 2017, 2018, just starting to do some, basic investments, and got captivated by the idea of DeFi on Ethereum in 2019 with Compound and then Aave and some of the other protocols. And something clicked. It wasn't any longer this idea that we have really, I'll call Bitcoin essentially a Ponzi scheme where more people, you're relying on them coming in to buy it, so the price goes up, but you could actually start to build a new financial system on top of rails that are decentralized and permissionless and not controlled by any single person. So that was exciting for me. And I really jumped into the deep end. And one of my loves is investigating a lot of different crypto ecosystems. So, I've been everywhere from, Luna to Multiverse X to Cardano to Solana. I've done a lot and I've experienced a lot. But early in my journey, it was around 2019, 2020, I discovered Monero. And there's something special about Monero that a lot of the other cryptocurrencies don't have. For those of you who may not be familiar, and I'm sure most of your viewers are, like Bitcoin is fully public. And while they like to talk about all these techniques that you can use to remain anonymous, because it's pseudonymous in Bitcoin, those all fail. And the reason they fail is because there's so many KYC transactions on the Bitcoin network right now that anyone with a little bit of AI and some patience can figure you out if you've done any meaningful set of transactions. And Monero shifts this whole dynamic by providing that guarantee of privacy. And so it was actually my brother who introduced me to Monero and said, "Hey, you should check this out." He's also very passionate about privacy and self-sovereignty. And it just seemed like the ultimate expression of where all of crypto was going, is to get to the point that we have truly anonymous digital cash that is unstoppable.
So what specific problems do you see Monero solving in that case? Where do you see it sitting in the, I suppose what role do you see it playing in society?
Yeah, it's very interesting because I think a lot of the folks in the Bitcoin community think that Bitcoin plays the role that Monero actually plays, and so they'll mention things about being self-sovereign, having money that can't be stopped by the government, and all of that is true except for the fact that they can completely track it. Most of the Bitcoin purchases in the US, in fact, almost all of them are KYC. So that means they know your name, your address, your phone number, your bank accounts. And if you were to do a transaction that they didn't like, well, maybe they couldn't come after your Bitcoin because, your Bitcoin's on the blockchain. You can always find a way to move it around, but they can come after you. And the example I like to use, pointing to a dystopian future is imagine a world where we have quotas for how much meat that we can buy. And you'd like to buy a little more meat for your family, whatever, to celebrate. It's Christmas, right? And you go out and you buy it with Bitcoin. Well, the government can see that and they can come after you. If you were to do the same thing and buy it with Monero, the government can't. So the way I like to express it is, if you believe that inflation and hyperinflation is a problem, Bitcoin solves that problem. But if you believe in a dystopian future where the government is your enemy and you need that level of privacy and that level of self-sovereignty, then Monero solves that. And some people might step back and say, okay, but that's a very adversarial world. Don't you only need privacy if you've done something wrong? And I think that's the slippery slope a lot of people get into. And it's the message that those who control the systems today like to send. No, we have privacy in all sorts of aspects of our lives. Things that are benign, we just would rather other people didn't know about them. And that level of privacy gives us sovereignty over our own thoughts. If you had every moment of your life examined, you would think different, you would act different, you would say different things. And that's what Monero ultimately allows us to do, is that expression of financial transactions. It allows us to do it free from any interference from the outside.
One of my favorite jokes, I suppose, memes in the Monero, in the Bitcoin community is when people say they lost their keys, like in a boating accident, obviously. But little do they, I don't even know if they've thought that far about. Obviously, the government can just trace your KYC address and everything to see exactly what you're spending. It's quite good.
They'll notice as soon as you do a transaction and say, "Oh, you found them again. That's nice."
Yeah, exactly. And now you owe us tax. I suppose it brings us to a good point. Like CBDC, social credit scores, do you see them being implemented? What timeframes are you giving them? And do you think, obviously you're in America, like, do you think there'll be a lot of pushback in America? How do you think the whole situation is going to play out?
Well, just so we're clear, CBDCs are here. China is already trialing it.
Right.
And they're creating money, and they're using the airdrop system. So kudos to them for learning from crypto, right? They're airdropping money, but they're doing things like having an expiry date on when you can spend your money. So that prevents people from saving, that prevents people from being self-sovereign. Very soon there'll be restrictions on how and when and where you can spend your money. And that's happening, and that's in China. Now, the EU has been very passionate about bringing forward CBDCs as well, and they're talking about how they can do that for their citizens. Obviously, climate change and carbon tax and all of that's very big in the EU, and I'd say that's extremely concerning. If I was a citizen of the EU, I would be very, very worried about it. In the US, I think we're a little more fractured, partly because there's this deep sense of kind of markets providing solutions and a wariness of the government. I think, I'm in Texas, very much expressed here in Texas that the government is not your dad. That they're in fact someone that needs to be held to account. And we've got a lot of very pro-Bitcoin politicians. I think they don't, quite get to the level of understanding Monero. And if they did, I think the challenge is there are very steeped interests in the government that want to track everything that you do. And so there's going to be a bit of friction there. I don't see the government necessarily introducing their own CBDC, but step back for a second. We already have one. It's called USDC.
Mm-hmm.
Circle can turn off your money at any point.
Mm-hmm.
They did. If you look back to Tornado Cash, now for those who aren't familiar, Tornado Cash is a system on Ethereum that allows you to create anonymity in your transactions and essentially, I don't want to say launder your money, but that's basically what you're doing is you're making it private. The developer who developed that system, public good to allow people privacy, is sitting in jail in the Netherlands. Circle turned off a bunch of the USDC that was related to it. Even Infura started to turn off accounts so you couldn't access them through MetaMask. This is a very centralized system. Why would the US government need to build a CBDC when they already have one? And everyone's using it, and it's one of the largest, highest market cap cryptos out there. So yeah, it's already here. It's here in many different forms.
So break that down a little bit more. So USDC Circle turning off, how exactly do they turn off the USDC? Is it through censorship of miners, or how does that actually work, I suppose?
Yeah, so when you create an ERC20 token, you have the ability to essentially control it. I don't know all the specifics of how it works, but it's governed by a smart contract. And they have ownership of that smart contract, and they can turn off selectively any coins based on that smart contract. So it's not something that's self-sovereign in any sense. Now, even if you look at Ethereum, the network as a whole, I will argue that very recently they had a coup. It used to be a system very similar to Bitcoin, where you had miners on one side, you had core developers on another side, and there was checks and balances in how you would evolve the network. Well, the elite within Ethereum just decided, we're going proof of stake. Sorry for you if you bought a mining equipment, have been supporting this network for the last 5 years. You're out of luck. And so I think that's very scary. I don't think ultimately, as much as the Ethereum folks like to talk about this idea that Ethereum is decentralized and is self-sovereign, it isn't. Right now, 80% of the transactions are OFAC compliant. OFAC is an organization within the United States that's involved in censoring and stopping transactions. The reason all of this is important, again, back to the fact that it's not because people are wanting to do something wrong. It's because you're delegating this power to those who might someday change their mind and decide what's right and wrong, decide who's right and wrong. And that's very, very challenging to give that level of control to any single entity, institution, or person.
So I suppose to go into that further, like what's your belief in DeFi? Do you think any ecosystems are decentralized enough to do it? Do you see that there's even value being created? What's your take on it?
A decentralized economy needs decentralized money. Now, you may have heard that most famously from Do Kwon in Luna, and we all know what happened there. But at the heart of it, it's still needed. There are very, very few decentralized stablecoins out there, truly decentralized. Now, someone might say DAI. DAI is a over-collateralized stablecoin on Ethereum. They might point to that and say it's decentralized. And yet, a good portion of what backs DAI is USDC. What do you think happens if Circle decides to turn off the USDC that's backing DAI? Oh, we see the tangled web we weave. And so I think, there were obviously flaws in the Luna protocol, clearly, given what happened. But the end goal of creating a stable, decentralized currency is still something that we need to aspire to. And I think, DeFi you can view from multiple different aspects. And I think there's maybe some folks in the system that say, okay, well, a currency like Monero or Bitcoin, if we have transactions, that's sufficient for freedom and sovereignty. I don't think so. I think our financial interactions are more complex than just a peer-to-peer transaction between two people. I think there's additional value that gets created when you can tokenize efforts and you can share value that's derived from protocols. And so that's what DeFi starts to allow you to do, especially this push into real yield on DeFi. And I'd say that's one area where I would love to see more evolution of kind of smart contract enabled privacy systems. A couple that I'm aware of, Darrow is talked about a lot. Cardano's working on a system called Midnight that is kind of selectively anonymous. And I would say Secret, although I've heard they've had their own set of challenges as well.
Okay, so just moving into like the next 12, 24 months, like speaking of, I suppose, what we've seen play out, what do you see happening in crypto as a whole in the next 12 to 24 months? To talk about FUD, cleanouts, regulation, etc.
If you'd asked me that a year ago, I would not have predicted anything that happened this last year. So
right.
For what it is, take that for what it is. But I think we're at a fork in the road, really. And I believe that there have been efforts from some very powerful, well-established people to do real harm to crypto. The most charitable view of what Sam Bankman-Fried has done is that he's a patsy for very powerful players in the system. I don't think he's that innocent, but you could maybe have that view. And I guess it has surfaced that he was one of the key players attacking the UST peg and Luna. And Luna was pretty much the domino that started everything. And so I think there's powerful forces allied against crypto, against privacy, and against self-sovereignty. And I think we'll start to see that play out as the discussions around regulation happen. Now, thankfully, we have a divided Congress in the US, which normally means that there's more compromise that needs to happen. So that's one good thing. We also have some very staunch advocates for crypto and for the innovation that it brings. And obviously, there's people on the other side. And so I think it'll be a long debate about regulation. We might start to see some aspects of it around, in particular, sort of stablecoins and auditing of what's being backed by stablecoins. Again, this is the thing that we don't yet have. We don't have decentralized, stable currency that we can share. And that's the thing that's most threatening to the existing system. And so they're going to go after that first, I believe, and partly with good sense, right? We've seen a lot of algorithmic stablecoins fail. Not all of them were as well designed as Luna, which also failed. And so I think that's going to be a thread. I think we'll start to see more kind of real use cases and real yield come into the system. So two projects I'm very excited about, Kujira is one, GMX is another, that are really building real yield on top of DeFi. you could argue that DeFi has just been Ponzonomics up until now, but there are true scenarios around, swapping and market making that are still at the core of it. And I think that will continue to grow. Regulation could bring clarity into how tokens are treated from a regulatory perspective, which may mean we see tokenization of more things if it's treated favorably, or we might see a complete wipeout of many of the altcoins in terms of the access to the US market, and that would be very concerning. So very much a fork in the road there.
So how do you see Monero adoption playing out? So obviously being in the US, well, being anywhere in the world, Monero is not like widely adopted. It still has its niche sort of on the dark market and within, I suppose, the privacy community. But I feel like out of anyone, people in Texas, for example, would love something like Monero. So how do you think Monero adoption plays out, and what do you think like we can do to speed up adoption and build adoption?
I think the best way to speed up adoption is to have some very prominent people targeted because of their Bitcoin transactions, because that will allow the story to really be told. People don't fully appreciate privacy until it's gone. And I think right now, still it's been a journey from custody your assets, Bitcoin, what is that with a centralized exchange, to, oh, that's actually a terrible idea. Like we've seen what's happened, self-custody. So that's step one, and that's a very hard step for people to take, just adopting self-custody. So I think whatever the Monero community can do to support that messaging and support that ownership is important. And then I think that the second thing is really just to lean into the values of privacy that are beyond, criminals doing nefarious things. I was thinking just this morning, if criminals really wanted to, use the financial system to do nefarious things, they do what they're doing today and go to HSBC and many of the large big banks that launder billions of dollars every year. And so I think we need to start to message and very much divorce ourselves from that kind of criminal element, because I don't think most people are criminal. I think they just want reasonable privacy over their transactions. Adoption is going to be difficult. I'm still, hopeful that it's accessible right now for people to, mine and to be a node within the network. That's kind of at the extreme level. But I think the more we can build applications that are easy, the more we can have an ecosystem where you can use your Monero as a currency. I think that's really what it's designed for, is a currency of exchange. It's less about just keep stacking and store your value. It's actually use. And one example of use, I know you just recently are launching a book, and so I spent some Monero, bought a book. Thank you for that.
Thank you for that.
If you're watching along, go and check out the Monero standard coming soon. And I think the more places in the ecosystem we have the ability to spend Monero, the better.
Okay, so one thing I personally worry about is something like you just mentioned. So say there was to be a tax on big Bitcoiners and say they go to jail or whatever the case is. One thing I worry about is the fact that people would just then be like, oh, crypto doesn't work. So we've seen like the shenanigans that's gone on lately. So people who are not familiar with crypto don't even know it's really not crypto. It's just Sam Bankman-Fried running his political Ponzi, or however you want to frame it. I worry about that with Bitcoin too. So people will go to jail, then people will say, oh, Bitcoin doesn't work. Well, I suppose it's going to slow down adoption. People are just going to say, well, we don't have any other option. We're just going to have to use the US dollar as normal. So what's your thoughts on that?
I don't want to get you banned from YouTube, but I compare Monero and actually Bitcoin as well, very much to the Second Amendment here in the United States. It's extremely controversial. Some people have used guns for extreme harm, but ultimately it's at the foundation in our Constitution as an important guarantee of freedom. And over time, more and more people are becoming aware of this, and you have some very staunch advocates for that level of freedom. And I think crypto and Monero in particular are very, very early on in that curve. Our founding fathers obviously didn't anticipate that we'd be in such a surveilled world and have this dire need for privacy. And yet we have the Fourth Amendment, which guarantees the citizens aren't subjected to illegal search and seizures that aren't reasonable. And so it's kind of in there in our ethos. We just need to lean a little bit harder into that and really, bolster Monero as a solution for it.
And what do you, I think it's called the Digital Commodities Consumer Protection Bill. I think Elizabeth Warren is either introducing it or has planned to introduce it. Are you concerned? Do you think it's going to come through?
She's such an interesting character, and I wonder who's pulling her strings. She used to be against big banks and really for the freedom of people to use money as they want. And I don't know if it's that she doesn't understand, or if she was given some nice big checks to change her mind. But Bitcoin, Monero, and crypto in general brings about almost everything that previously for the last decade she's been talking about. And so I'm very confused. I do think that some of these bills will hopefully meet with staunch resistance. Again, going back to the fact that we now have a divided Congress makes discussion necessary. And I think these complicated issues, hopefully, in the past, the US government has typically been very moderated in how it stops innovation. If you think about the internet and just this notion of public-private key cryptography, that was huge. And there was a lot of debate back in the day among cypherpunks about, is this a good thing? And there was export restrictions on it. If you remember the first versions of Netscape, if you gave it to Iran, then you would go to jail for giving it to Iran because it had SSL encryption in it. And so I think that'll all play out. Hopefully, it'll play out in a way that they're reasonable and regulations are provided that give guardrails for how people should view it rather than prescriptions. And you can see even in the discussion around proof of work versus proof of stake, it's very concerning if government tries to decide exactly how a system should work. And I'm hoping that they will kind of moderate and deal with the key problems. Because, for example, if you look at Sam Bankman-Fried and FTX, it was just plain fraud. Mm-hmm. And we have laws against that. And maybe there's something around, if you're running a crypto exchange, the existing laws still apply to you, which would be my hopeful, optimistic take where it ends up.
That's exactly what I was going to say. This new bill, I think it's to ban like transaction providers and all that kind of stuff. Fraud was already illegal, Yes. It's quite remarkable.
Yeah, and back to the whole Second Amendment, right? It's illegal to harm someone. And right. Putting up a sign that says, it's a gun-free zone doesn't change the fact that it's still illegal to harm someone. We have those laws. And so let's enforce the laws that we have. Let's hold criminals to account and let the ecosystem as a whole begin to innovate, because we've only just begun. How old is DeFi? A handful of years, 4 or 5 years at most?
Well, that's all right. It's a big opportunity, but you know what they say, never let a crisis go to waste. That's like the oldest saying in the book.
Yeah, they're very good at not letting crises go to waste.
Vanessa, thanks so much for coming on.
It was a wonderful, really enjoy it. And thank you for having me, Michael.
No worries. Thanks for coming on, and Merry Christmas again.
Merry Christmas.